You didn't wake up one day and decide to disappear. You didn't consciously choose to become smaller, quieter, safer. It happened slowly, and that's what makes it hard to see. Because nothing dramatic happened. No collapse, no betrayal, no obvious mistake. Just small adjustments, small rewards, small approvals. And over time, those adjustments began to shape you. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You were trained into this, not by force, not by manipulation, but by repetition. When you were praised for being calm, you stayed calm. When you were rewarded for being reliable, you became reliable. When you were accepted for being agreeable, you learned to smooth your edges. No one sat you down and said, become less alive. But the world doesn't need to say it directly. It just rewards what fits, and slowly, you fit. That's the part we rarely admit. You didn't lose yourself in one big decision. You adapted in 100 small ones. An adaptation feels intelligent, responsible, mature. But here's the danger. What gets rewarded gets repeated. What gets repeated becomes natural. What becomes natural starts to feel like identity, and identity feels permanent. That's how drift turns into personality. That's how personality turns into, this is just who I am. We don't question what gets validated. We reinforce it. I've done this too. We all have. Because belonging feels safer than becoming. And safety is persuasive. It convinces you that shrinking is stability. That silence is peace. That fitting in is alignment. But fitting in is not the same as choosing. And if you've ever wondered how you ended up inside a life that feels structured but not authored, this is where it began. Not with failure, not with weakness, with conditioning. And conditioning is powerful because you don't feel controlled. You feel normal. Conditioning sounds complicated. It isn't. It simply means this. You repeat what gets rewarded. You avoid what gets punished. That's it. From childhood, you learned what worked. If you were quiet and mature, adults praised you. If you were easy to manage, people liked you. If you achieved, you received validation. And validation feels good. Your nervous system remembers that. So you repeat it. Not because you're weak, because you're human. Over time, you start scanning rooms unconsciously. What version of me fits here? What behavior will be approved? What tone will be accepted? And you adjust. Again, and again, and again, until adjustment feels automatic. There's a moment most people don't notice. You stop asking, what do I want? And start asking, what works here? That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because what works depends on environment. An environment is rarely designed around your authenticity. It's designed around efficiency, predictability, comfort. So the parts of you that are intense, curious, uncertain, risky, get edited out, not dramatically, gradually. We tell ourselves we're just being realistic, just adapting, just surviving. And survival mode is powerful. In survival mode, you don't create. You respond. You don't explore. You stabilize. And stabilization becomes your personality. Eventually, you don't feel trained. You feel normal. But normal doesn't always mean aligned. It just means repeated. And the more repetition shapes you, the harder it becomes to see that it's shaping you at all. There's another layer most people never examine. It's not just personal conditioning. It's collective conditioning. You weren't shaped alone. You were shaped inside a system that rewards predictability, a system that rewards productivity, a system that rewards stability over intensity. And systems don't need to be cruel to be powerful. They just need to be consistent. From school onward, you learn quickly what gets attention. Finish the task, follow the rules, be cooperative, be impressive. And the reward isn't always money. It's approval, it's belonging, it's recognition. And belonging is one of the strongest psychological drivers we have. Your brain is wired to avoid exclusion. Rejection once meant danger. Isolation once meant vulnerability. So when approval is offered, your nervous system locks onto it. You feel safe, seen, accepted. And slowly, you begin optimizing for that feeling. You shape your behavior toward what maintains inclusion. You smooth the parts of you that feel unpredictable. You reduce the parts that create friction. You become easier to integrate. And integration feels like maturity. But integration has a cost. The cost is intensity. The cost is unpredictability. The cost is self-creation. Nietzsche warned about something he called the herd. People often misunderstand that word. They assume it means weakness. But he wasn't insulting individuals. He was describing a psychological pattern. The herd is the pull towards safety in numbers, towards shared beliefs, towards shared values, towards shared definitions of success. It's not evil. It's stabilizing, but it can quietly replace your own internal compass. When belonging becomes more important than becoming, you begin shaping yourself toward what is already accepted. You choose careers that are respected. You adopt goals that are admired. You define success the way others define it. And if those definitions bring approval, you double down. No one forces you. You feel motivated. You feel driven. You feel ambitious. But ambition shaped by external validation feels different than ambition shaped by inner alignment. One feels urgent. The other feels alive. You can sense the difference. Urgency is anxious. Aliveness is energized. Urgency asks, will this be enough? Aliveness asks, does this feel true? Most people are trained to respond to urgency. Deadlines, expectations, milestones, benchmarks, comparison, social proof. You measure yourself against what is visible, and what is visible is often what is rewarded. Titles, income, status, stability. And when those metrics increase, you receive confirmation. You are doing it right. You are progressing. You are succeeding. But succeeding at what? That question rarely gets asked, because asking it destabilizes the structure. There's a moment that reveals this clearly. You scroll through social media. You see someone your age achieving something, buying something, announcing something, and your body reacts before your mind does. A slight tightening, a subtle comparison. You don't consciously choose it. It happens automatically, because the system constantly feeds you visible standards, and you adjust. Again, you recalibrate your expectations. You modify your goals. You chase alignment with what is seen as ahead, and slowly, your definition of a good life begins to look more and more like everyone else's. We tell ourselves, this is ambition, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it's mimicry. Not because you're shallow, but because you're immersed. Immersion shapes perception. When everyone around you defines success one way, it feels irrational to define it differently, and irrationality feels unsafe. So you adapt. You adapt your dreams. You adapt your personality. You adapt your risk tolerance. You adapt your voice. And after years of adaptation, you forget what your unadapted voice sounded like. That's the quiet impact of collective conditioning. It doesn't erase you. It edits you. You become a version of yourself that fits the dominant narrative. Not because you're fake, but because fitting feels secure. And security is powerful. Security tells you, this is responsible. This is realistic. This is what adults do. And over time, you stop distinguishing between what feels secure and what feels aligned. They start to merge, but they are not the same. Security is about minimizing loss. Alignment is about maximizing truth. And truth is rarely optimized for comfort. That's why so many people reach stability and still feel restless. They achieved what the system rewards, but not necessarily what their internal compass desired. And here's the dangerous part. The system doesn't pause to ask whether you're aligned. It only confirms whether you're performing. As long as you perform well, you're validated. As long as you produce, you're praised. As long as you stay consistent, you're respected. But performance is not authorship. Production is not identity. Consistency is not choice. You can be deeply integrated into the system and still feel slightly displaced inside yourself. That displacement isn't weakness. It's friction between conditioning and consciousness. When you start noticing that friction, it can feel confusing because nothing externally is broken. You are succeeding, you are contributing, you are functioning, and yet you feel like something about your direction was inherited, not designed. That's not an insult to your effort. You worked hard, you made decisions, but the environment shaped the options. The rewards shaped the repetitions, and the repetitions shaped the identity. This is how someone slowly becomes a version of themselves they never consciously set out to become. Not through collapse, through compliance, not through failure, through optimization, not through weakness, through repetition. And repetition is powerful because it turns behavior into personality, and personality into, this is just who I am. But if who you are was shaped by what was rewarded, then it's worth asking one uncomfortable question. If the rewards had been different, who would you be? Here's the part that changes the way you see yourself. You didn't drift because you were weak. You drifted because you were adaptive. And adaptation is intelligence. From the beginning, your nervous system has one primary job: keep you safe, not fulfilled, not self-actualized, safe. That's why you learned quickly what reduced tension, what increased approval, what prevented rejection, what minimized conflict. Your brain reinforced those patterns, not because you lacked courage, because you were optimizing for survival. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher, wrote something powerful. You become what you give your attention to. Most people interpret that as motivation. Focus on good things. Think positively. But psychologically, it means something deeper. Attention shapes identity. What you repeatedly attend to becomes your internal priority. If you repeatedly attend to approval, approval becomes central. If you repeatedly attend to safety, safety becomes dominant. If you repeatedly attend to stability, stability becomes sacred. And slowly, your sense of self organizes around those priorities. That's not weakness. That's conditioning, interacting with biology. We are not built to rebel by default. We are built to attach, to adapt, to integrate. So when you chose the stable path, you weren't betraying yourself. You were responding to the environment you were in. When you silenced your intensity, you weren't shrinking. You were regulating risk. When you chose predictability, you weren't lazy. You were conserving energy. That reframing matters, because without it, you blame yourself. You say, I should have been braver. I should have known better. I should have taken more risks. But you made decisions with the information and reinforcement available to you at the time. And reinforcement is powerful. Behavioral psychology shows this clearly. Behaviors followed by reward increase. Behaviors followed by discomfort decrease. It's simple. It's mechanical. And you were inside that loop for years. Reward for being agreeable. Reward for being productive. Reward for being responsible. Discomfort when being disruptive. Discomfort when questioning authority. Discomfort when stepping outside expectation. Over time, you learn which parts of yourself are expensive and which parts are profitable. You don't consciously calculate this. Your nervous system does. It says, this version of you survives better, so you strengthen that version. And weakening other parts feels like maturity. But here's where the shift begins. Survival mode is effective in unstable environments. But when survival becomes permanent, you start living defensively. Not creatively, you optimize against loss. Not toward truth. You reduce risk, not expand identity. That's why something inside you feels slightly compressed. Not broken, compressed. Because the parts of you that were exploratory, expressive, uncertain, didn't disappear. They just weren't reinforced. And unrewarded parts of us tend to go quiet. Not because they're gone, because they weren't invited. There's a difference between choosing a stable life consciously and being shaped into one unconsciously. One feels grounded, the other feels automatic. If you consciously examined your path and said, yes, this aligns with who I am, that's authorship. But if you simply followed what reduced tension, that's conditioning. And conditioning doesn't mean you failed. It means you adapted well, maybe too well. You became efficient at functioning, efficient at fitting, efficient at performing. And performance is praised, but performance can distance you from spontaneity. You become controlled, measured, reliable, but less surprised by yourself, less curious, less alive. And here's the important distinction. You are not the problem. The pattern is. You are not defective. The loop is. You are not broken. The repetition is. That shift is subtle, but it removes unnecessary shame, because shame keeps you stuck in identity. Understanding frees you to question identity, not destroy it. Question it. There's something empowering about realizing this wasn't random, that your current self was shaped by predictable forces. Because if forces shaped you, forces can also reshape you. Not instantly, not dramatically, but consciously. And consciousness is different from reaction. When you see the mechanism, you stop personalizing the outcome. You stop saying, this is just who I am, and start saying, this is what I repeated. And repetition can change, but that realization comes with discomfort. Because once you see the pattern, you can't blame fate. You can't blame personality. You can't blame that's just how I am. You start recognizing the invisible training, the invisible rewards, the invisible fear of exclusion. And awareness creates responsibility, not blame. Responsibility. Responsibility to decide whether you want to keep reinforcing the same loop. That decision isn't easy, because safety is seductive. But safety is not identity. It's a strategy, and strategies can evolve. The question isn't, why did I become this? The question is, was this shaped by intention or repetition? And if the answer is repetition, then maybe the discomfort you feel isn't a flaw. It's a signal that your adaptive self kept you safe. But your conscious self is ready to examine the direction. If you're honest, Part of you has been blaming yourself for years. Not loudly, quietly. You call yourself indecisive, unambitious, too cautious, not bold enough, not creative enough, not driven enough. You look at people who seem intense, certain, self-directed, and you assume something is missing in you. But what if nothing was missing? What if you were simply shaped inside a system that rewarded predictability more than intensity? It's easy to compare yourself to someone who took risks. It's harder to acknowledge the environment that encouraged your stability. We like stories about rebellion, about dramatic change, about bold leaps, but most lives are shaped by smaller forces. Approval, expectation, fear of exclusion, economic pressure, cultural norms. And those forces are powerful, not because they control you, because they influence repetition. You didn't wake up and say, I want to shrink. You woke up and said, I want to stay safe. You woke up and said, I want to belong. You woke up and said, I don't want to lose what I've built. And those are reasonable desires. Marcus Aurelius wrote about focusing on what is within your control. But he also understood something subtle. Control isn't just about action. It's about awareness. You can't control what shaped you, but you can become aware of how it shaped you. And awareness changes the tone of the story you tell about yourself. Instead of, I'm just not that kind of person, you begin to say, I learned to become this kind of person. That shift is quiet, but it removes shame, because shame says something is wrong with you. Understanding says something influenced you. You are not the sum of your adaptations. You are the one who adapted. And that difference matters, because adaptation is a skill. You survived environments that required stability. You navigated expectations. You built structure. You earned trust. You created predictability. Those are strengths. They are not evidence of smallness. They are evidence of intelligence. But intelligence without reflection becomes autopilot. And autopilot feels permanent until you question it. There's something uncomfortable about realizing this. Because once you understand the mechanism, you can't unsee it. You start noticing where you automatically adjust, where you soften your voice, where you suppress intensity, where you prioritize approval over authenticity. And you may feel frustrated. You may even feel regret. Why didn't I see this earlier? But regret assumes you had full visibility. You didn't. You were inside the pattern, and patterns are hardest to see from within. That's why awareness feels like waking up. Not because everything changes immediately, but because the fog lifts slightly. And when the fog lifts, you stop attacking yourself. You stop saying, I ruined my own life, and start saying, I was shaped by forces I never examined. That realization is not an excuse. It's context, and context changes how you relate to yourself. If this helped you see yourself more clearly, even slightly, then maybe the story you've been telling about your weakness was never accurate. Maybe you weren't broken. Maybe you were conditioned, and conditioning can be understood. And what can be understood can eventually be chosen. But before choice comes clarity, and clarity is what we're building here. Now that you see the pattern, something shifts, not externally, internally. Because once you understand that repetition shaped you, you stop seeing your current self as destiny. You start seeing it as momentum, and momentum is powerful. But momentum is not fate. There's a difference between saying, this is who I am, and saying, this is who I became. That difference feels small, but psychologically it's massive. Because who I am feels fixed. Who I became implies process, and process implies possibility. You weren't randomly lost. You were gradually shaped. You weren't uniquely flawed. You were consistently reinforced. And reinforcement is predictable. If you reward a behavior, it grows. If you ignore a behavior, it fades. That's not philosophy. That's basic behavioral psychology. Over time, the rewarded version of you became louder. The unrewarded version became quieter. Not dead, quieter. There's something almost relieving about that realization, because it means your intensity didn't disappear. Your curiosity didn't vanish. Your restlessness didn't prove immaturity. They just weren't the traits that got applause. So they stepped back. And you stepped forward with the version that worked. But here's where the deeper discomfort begins. If you were shaped by repetition, then some part of you has been living reactively, not consciously. Reactively. You reacted to approval, to fear, to expectation, to visible standards. You reacted well. You survived well. You succeeded well. But reaction is not the same as authorship. And when you start noticing that difference, it creates friction, because authorship requires awareness. And awareness removes the comfort of unconsciousness. You can't go back to believing this was random. You can't go back to saying, this is just my personality. Now you know it was shaped. Now you know it was trained. Now you know it was reinforced. And that knowledge does something subtle. It puts a question in your hands. Not a solution, a question. If this version of you was built through repetition, what are you still repeating? Where are you still adjusting automatically? Where are you still prioritizing safety over truth? That's not a demand for rebellion. It's an invitation to notice. Because the danger isn't that you adapted. The danger is continuing to adapt unconsciously. You don't need to destroy your life. You don't need to quit everything. You don't need dramatic change. But you do need clarity. Clarity about what shaped you. Clarity about what still shapes you. Clarity about whether you are choosing or simply continuing a loop. There's a line we rarely cross. The line between adaptation and self-abandonment. Most people don't realize when they cross it because it feels gradual. But once you see the mechanism, you can't pretend you didn't. And that's where this becomes uncomfortable. Because understanding removes excuses, not in a harsh way, in an honest way. You were conditioned, yes, but now you're aware. And awareness shifts responsibility, not blame. Responsibility. Responsibility to examine whether the life you are maintaining is still being maintained by fear of loss or by genuine alignment. That's a different level of question. And that question deserves its own space. Because understanding the mechanism is one thing. Letting go of the blame you've carried because of it is something deeper. In the next part, we're going to go there. Into the part most people skip. The part where you stop attacking yourself for adapting. The part where you separate your worth from the pattern. If this explanation helped you see the structure more clearly, stay with it. The next step isn't about fixing your life. It's about releasing the weight you never needed to carry in the first place. You'll find that next part in the description. There's something quietly painful about this realization. Not dramatic, not explosive, just heavy. Because once you understand that you were shaped, you can't fully return to the story that something was wrong with you. And that story might have been easier. It's strangely comforting to believe you were just lazy, or not disciplined enough, or not bold enough. At least that makes it personal. At least that gives you something clear to blame. But this is more complicated. You weren't weak. You were responsive. You weren't broken. You were reinforced. You weren't directionless. You were guided by visible rewards. And visible rewards are powerful. They create certainty. They create comparison. They create urgency. They rarely create authorship. Here's the subtle shift happening inside you right now. You're starting to see that the version of you that feels stuck isn't defective. It's conditioned. And conditioning is not a character flaw. It is a survival strategy. But survival strategies, when left unexamined, become identity. That's where the confusion begins. You look at your current life and think, this must just be me. But now you're seeing the layers, the reinforcement, the repetition, the invisible training. And that awareness does something uncomfortable. It separates you from the pattern. You start to realize there's you, and then there's what you repeated. Those are not the same thing. And that distinction can feel destabilizing. Because if your identity was shaped, then who are you without the shaping? That question is not easy. It's not supposed to be. It challenges the stability you built. But it also explains something you may have carried silently for years. That faint feeling of disconnection. That slight distance. That subtle sense that something about your direction was inherited rather than authored. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't immaturity. It wasn't failure. It was adaptation without examination. And examination changes the tone of everything. When you see the loop, you stop personalizing the outcome. You stop attacking yourself for not being someone else. You stop comparing your internal confusion to someone else's external confidence, because you now understand something deeper. Most confidence you see is also conditioned. Most stability you admire was also reinforced. Most identities you compare yourself to were shaped by reward structures you don't see. That doesn't invalidate your discomfort. It explains it. An explanation reduces unnecessary shame. But here's where the tension deepens. Understanding the mechanism is one thing. Emotionally releasing the blame you've attached to yourself because of it is something else. You may intellectually see that you were shaped, but part of you still whispers, I should have known better. That voice is strong. It sounds responsible, but it may not be fair, because you can't criticize yourself for not seeing a pattern you were inside. You can't condemn yourself for adapting to forces you were immersed in. You can't punish yourself for surviving well. And yet, many people do. They carry silent guilt for not being more intense, more rebellious, more self-directed, without realizing the system they were shaped inside rarely rewarded those traits. So here's the honest place to land. You didn't become this version of yourself overnight. You were gradually reinforced into it, and now you're gradually becoming aware of it. That awareness is not a failure. It's the beginning of something quieter. Not dramatic change, not immediate transformation, but honesty. And honesty is where self-blame begins to loosen. In the next part, we're going to go directly into that weight, into the guilt you've been carrying, into the narrative that says you should have been different. Because understanding the structure is step one. Letting yourself off the hook for adapting to it is step two. If this explanation made something inside you soften, even slightly, stay with the next part. It's not about changing your life. It's about changing how you see yourself inside it. You'll find it in the description.